Greetings and salutations. Today, we will be covering the case of the Black Dahlia. It was the early morning of January 15th, 1947, when a mother taking her child for a walk in Los Angeles stumbled upon a gruesome sight. It was the body of a young woman, naked, sliced clean in half at the waist. The woman's identity was later found out to be 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, who would later be dubbed the Black Dahlia by the press for her supposed preference for black clothes, and as a link to the movie The Blue Dahlia, which had come out around the time. Sometime after the discovery of the body, the Los Angeles Police Department would begin an extensive investigation, which would eventually yield more than 150 suspects, persons of interest, starting from the top. When Robert Manley drove Elizabeth Short to Los Angeles on January 9th, 1947, he noticed that she would frequently turn around in her seat and focus in on cars that passed them on the road. But she said nothing. He dropped her off at the Baltimore hotel that evening. Manley said she was wearing a black suit without a collar, and a fluffy white blouse, white gloves, nylons, high-heeled shoes, and a full-length beige coat. Elizabeth was noted to use a payphone and ladies' room within the hotel. Some accounts have Manley checking the desk to see if her sister had left word for her, and after a while he said his goodbyes and made his way home. Police initially interrogated him. He said, "I was infuriated, that's all. I couldn't tell if Betty was a gold digger or a nice girl." Elizabeth Short would stay at the hotel for a short time, a few hours, before she walked into Olive Street, then headed south. As far as the police could gather, that was the last time she could be positively identified. However, a number of people would come forward claiming that they had seen her out and about town. Later, when being interviewed by Frank Jameson, an individual by the name of Mark Hansen stated that he received a telephone call from her, but he wasn't sure of the date. Jameson said, "We do have information now and evidence that would establish that you haven't told us exactly the truth in connection with what conversations you did have with Elizabeth Short, and our information is that you received a telephone call from Elizabeth Short from the Baltimore hotel the evening of the 9th of January 1947. Hansen would also be questioned about receiving a telegram. He told Jameson that he had no recollection, admitting that "I have received a phone call. I don't recall any telegram. There may have been a telegram. I don't recall. But I know this phone call. I remember that very distinctly because Anne wasn't home. She was visiting her folks." As it turns out, Anne Toth had expected to see Beth in Northern California. However, unfortunately, she had lost track of her. A statement from her goes as follows. "Gee, the funny part of it, I was thinking of her all the time I was gone, wondering what became of her, because she didn't say goodbye to me. Anne said Elizabeth had told her about 3 weeks before Christmas that she was going to Berkeley to see her sister. She would continue on saying, but instead she went to San Diego. Why, I don't know. Just before Christmas, she wired me saying she needed $20. She had been gone for about 3 weeks when I received another wire, saying she was coming back, stating that a letter would follow. That was the last I ever heard of her. The letter never came." Marjorie Graham, Beth's friend from Boston and her roommate in Hollywood, was interviewed after the murder. She said, "After staying with me for a month, she went to live with a private family when I left Hollywood in October. She said she was going down to San Diego because the weather in Los Angeles was getting too cold." It was noted that Elizabeth had spent several hours in the Baltimore hotel, where she was seen using said telephone, making a series of calls, then going to the ladies' room. At about 10 p.m., she walked out of the lobby doors of the Baltimore hotel and went down Olive Street, then turned south. Here we have circled back. On the morning of January 15th, at 11:07 a.m., Betty Bersinger, who was a resident of 3705 South Norton Avenue, had been walking her daughter in a stroller when she saw what she initially believed to be a mannequin. However, she would soon realize it was a corpse. The body itself was found in 2 pieces, laying in an empty lot. It should be noted that the west side of South Norton Avenue was within the Leimert Park neighborhood. This was a relatively undeveloped area at the time. This meant that she had to run to a nearby home, asking to use the telephone, to which she was allowed to, and she called the police, reporting what she had witnessed. The body had seemingly been washed by its killer. Elizabeth Short's face had been slashed from the corners of her mouth and ears, giving her what is more ubiquitously known as a Glasgow smile. She had several cuts on her thighs and her breasts, where entire portions of her flesh had been sliced away. The lower half of the body was about a foot away from the upper body, and her intestines had been clearly stuffed beneath her butt. The body had been positioned with her hands over her head, her elbows bent at right angles, along with her legs spread apart. Upon discovery, a crowd quickly amassed, causing reporters to quickly flock into the scene. Aggie Underwood, a reporter for the Los Angeles Herald-Express, arrived quickly and was amongst the first to arrive at the scene, quickly capturing several photos of the corpse and the crime scene. Near the body, detectives quickly located a heel print on the ground amidst a set of tire tracks, along with a cement sack containing watery blood. All of this was found relatively nearby to the body. However, it would not be until 11:18 a.m. that police officers S.J. Lambert along with J.W. Hawkins would arrive at the scene, receiving a 10:54 or a man-down call. It would take an estimated 12 minutes for the LAPD homicide detective Sergeant Phineas A. Brown and his partner, Detective Harry L. Hansen from Central Division, to arrive on scene. An early report by the LAPD described the victim as such. The body was completely free of blood smears and stains, which clearly indicated that it had been washed sometime after death. The report went further on to state there were strangulation marks around the neck, and definite rope or tie marks on both arms and legs. Police officer Lambert would go on to report, in the driveway leading to the body were tire track arms. Police officer Lambert, which may have been left by the car used to dispose of the body. On this track was a smear that may have been left by a bloody shoe. There was a blood spot from the curve on the driveway around a group of bloodstains, which was found by a bag that formerly contained cement. As time passed, more officers and newspaper reporters showed up at the scene of the crime. After the coroner had removed the body, the investigation had truly begun. Headlines and stories and photographs of the Black Dahlia would dominate the front pages of newspapers for weeks to come. Phineas Brown believed that the killer had been a publicity hound. He noted that the body was likely dumped in an area in clear view in order to have it sighted quickly. He did not believe that the body was thrown or laid out, but rather said it would indicate that it was dropped. The upper half was quite a little further in. The left foot, was about a foot from the sidewalk. The person wouldn't have had to drop the body or flip it out there. They wouldn't have to lean over it to do it. You know, it didn't land absolutely straight. If it had been laying right together. The two halves were about a foot apart, but the legs were spread, and the type of mutilation that was done would indicate a person, to my estimate, who had a mania for publicity. The newspaper, up until the 23rd, when things began to slack off, and were only had one page in the newspaper column, the 23rd and 24th, that night received the belongings of the short girl. The next day, it was full. The papers were full of it then. It continued that way until altogether about 33 days. To my estimation, the person sent that because they wanted publicity to gloat over the fact that they had been successful in their crime and got a kick out of it. The belongings that Brown had referred to included an address book with Mark Hansen's name embossed on the cover. The book originally had about 400 pages, although many had been removed. Investigators compared the writing with the letters that Beth sent to her mother and determined that most of the writing in the book was hers. There were 3 or 4 pages written in another hand. He would go on to say, I can't remember the pages. There was in one, torn out in 3 places. Just a few pages, 5 or 6 in one place is the most. In another place, 1 or 2, 3 or 4. And cut out was about 4 places with which ranged from anywhere from 3 to 4 pages and nearly 100 pages. The formal autopsy report goes as follows. On January 16, 1947, the autopsy was performed by Frederick Newbar, the Los Angeles County coroner. Newbar's autopsy stated that Short had been 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighed 115 pounds, going on to say that the victim had light blue eyes, brown hair, and notably decayed teeth, stating that there were ligature marks on her ankles, wrists, and neck, along with an irregular laceration with superficial tissue loss on her right breast. Newbar also noted superficial lacerations on the right forearm, upper left arm, and on the lower left side of the chest. The body had been cut completely in half using a technique taught in the 1930s called the hemerocorpectomy. The lower half of the body had been removed by transecting the lumbar spine between the second and third lumbar vertebrae, thus severing the intestine at the duodenum. Newbar's report noted very little ecchymosis, aka bruising, along the insurrection line, suggesting that it had been performed after death, and along with another gaping laceration measuring 4 1/4 inches in length, ran longitudinally from the umbilicus to the subpubic region. The lacerations on each side of the face, which extended from the corners of the lips, were measured at 3 inches on the right side of the face and 2.5 inches on the left side. The skull was not fractured, but there was bruising noticed on the front side of her scalp, with a small amount of bleeding in the subcarotenoid space on the right side, consistent with blows to the head. The cause of death was determined to be hemorrhaging from the lacerations to her face. The shock from the blows to the head and face. Newbar noted that Short's anal canal was dilated at 1 3/4 inches, suggesting she might have been raped. Samples were taken from her body for testing for the presence of sperm, but the results came back negative. Short had been identified later by her fingerprints thanks to the FBI. Said fingerprints were on file from her 1943 arrest. Immediately following Short's identification, reporters would be sent by the Los Angeles Examiner in order to speak with the victim's mother, Phoebe Short, deceptively telling her that her daughter had won a beauty contest. The reporters would not tell their mother about their daughter's unfortunate fate until they had extracted as much personal information as they could from Phoebe. Then, reporters would unceremoniously explain that her daughter had been butchered and killed. Newspapers would then go on to offer her airfare along with accommodations if she would join them in Los Angeles to help with the police investigation. Sadly for Phoebe, the reporters had been rather unscrupulous by attempting to keep her away from the police along with other reporters in order to protect their exclusive. The Examiner, Los Angeles Herald Express, would go on to sensationalize the case, with one article from the Examiner describing the black tailored suit Short was last seen in as a tight skirt and a sheer blouse. The media would also go on to dub Elizabeth Short with a name she became truly synonymous with, the Black Dahlia, and described her as an adventuress that had prowled Hollywood Boulevard. The Los Angeles Times also claimed that the murder was a sex fiend slaying. On January 17th, even though the authorities had not informed them of such angle being a part of the case itself. January 21st, 1947, a person claiming to have been the killer called the office of James Richardson, the editor of the Examiner. Said individual would go on to congratulate Richardson for its coverage of the case. He said that he intended to eventually surrender himself to the authorities. However, this would only be after the police pursued him further. Additionally, the caller told Richardson to expect some more souvenirs of Beth Short in the mail. On January 24th, a suspicious envelope appeared. The envelope had been found by a U.S. Postal Service employee. The Examiner, along with a myriad of other Los Angeles newspapers, would note that the letter had been made with words that were cut out from newspaper clippings. Here is the Dahlia's belongings, the letter had scrawled on its surface. The envelope contained Short's birth certificate, business cards, photographs, along with the embossed address book previously mentioned. The packet had also suspiciously been treated with gasoline, in a strikingly similar way to Short's bodies. This led the police to suspect the packet had actually been sent by the killer, rather than being a fake sent by someone who was looking for fame or sick kicks. However, several partial fingerprints were also able to be lifted from the envelope, which were promptly sent to the FBI. Unfortunately, the prints had become compromised while in transit, meaning they could not be used for forensic analysis. This same day, a packet was received by the examiner. A handbag and black shoes were supposedly seen on a garbage can in an alley a short distance from Norton Avenue. This was a mere 2 miles from where Short's body had been discovered. Said items were quickly connected to the crime due to having also been wiped clean with gasoline. There is also a supposed suicide note written in pencil on a bit of paper that was found tucked into a shoe in a pile of men's clothing by the ocean's edge. This was found at the foot of Breeze Avenue, Venice. It was found on March 14th, and the note read as follows: "To whom it may concern, I have waited for the police to capture me for the Black Dahlia killing, but I have not. I am too much of a coward to turn myself in, so this is the best way out for me. I can't help myself for that or this. Sorry, Mary." Captain L.E. Christensen of the West Los Angeles police station was immediately notified after the discovery. Police quickly began to focus on Mark Hessen, the owner of the address book found in the packet, viewing him as a prime suspect. Hessen was a wealthy local nightclub owner and theater owner. He had also made the acquaintanceship of Elizabeth Short. According to some sources, they also confirmed that the purse and the shoe discovery in the alley had been Short's. Ann Tooth, Short's friend and roommate, told investigators that Short had recently rejected sexual advances from Hessen, going on to suggest that it might be the potential cause for him to kill her. However, he was quickly cleared of suspicion in this case. The Los Angeles Police Department would go on to interview more than 150 men whom they believed could be potential suspects. Mainly, an individual by the name of Manley had been one of the last people to see Short alive, so he was a person of interest as well. Resources had been diverted to investigate him. However, he too would quickly be cleared of suspicion after multiple polygraph tests were done on him. Police would go on to use Hansen's address book to identify individuals who might have been suspects or could be connected to the case. This included Martin Lewis, who had been known as an acquaintance of Short. Lewis was able to provide an alibi for the date of Short's murder. He was in Portland, Oregon at the time. There had been a total of 750 investigators from the LAPD, along with other departments which had been assigned to the investigation, including 250 California State Patrol officers and another 400 sheriff's deputies. Large swaths of LA had been scoured for any trace of evidence. This would include storm drains throughout the area, along with abandoned buildings. Various spots of the LA River would also be searched. However, regardless of these efforts, these searches yielded no further results. Things would get to a point that a city councilman would go on to post a $10,000 reward for any information leading to Short's killer. After the announcement of the reward, various persons came forward with confessions. Most of these the police deemed to be false. Several individuals came forward with false information. They would be charged with obstruction of justice. On January 26, another letter was received by the examiner. This time it was handwritten, and it read, "Here it is. Turning in Wednesday, January 29th at 10 a.m. Had my fun at the police. Black Dahlia Avenger." This letter also specified a location which the supposed killer would be at to turn himself in. The police waited at the location on the morning of January 29th. However, no individual would come up claiming to be the killer. Rather, at 1 p.m., the examiner's office received another letter, which read as, "I have changed my mind. You would not give me a square deal. Dahlia killing was justified." The graphic nature of the crime and the subsequent letters received by the examiner had resulted in a mass media attention becoming hyper-focused on the Black Dahlia murder in both the local and the national press. Both of these covered the story heavily. Many of these changed, sensationalized, or exaggerated the reports in a myriad of different ways. Some going as far as to suggest things that had no basis in the investigation, such as suggesting that Elizabeth had been tortured for hours prior to her death. However, the police allowed this information to continue to be disseminated by the press in order to conceal the true cause of death, which was once again cerebral hemorrhaging. Further reports about Short's personal life eventually were put to print, which included accounts and claims about her declining Hansen's advances. There was also a stripper who was an acquaintance of Short's, who told the police she liked to get guys worked up over her and leave them hanging dry. This led to some reporters and a few detectives to take into account the distinct possibility that Short might have been a lesbian, and begun questioning employees and patrons of gay bars in Los Angeles. However, this claim was proven to be baseless. The Herald Express also received a letter from the supposed killer, once more made out of newspaper clippings. This one read, "I will give up on Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me." On February 1st, the Los Angeles Daily News reported that the case had run into a stone wall, a veritable dead end, with no leads for investigators to pursue. The Examiner continued to run stories on the murder as front-page news for a total of 35 days following the discovery of the victim's body. Investigator Captain Jack Danu would go on to tell the press that he believed Short's murder had taken place in a remote building or shack on the outskirts of Los Angeles, along with specifying that her body had been transported into the city to be disposed of. Now, one of the avenues of investigation that wasn't as widely publicized was due to observations on the preciseness of the cuts done to the corpse. This led the LAPD to look at the possibility that the murderer had been a surgeon, a doctor, or somebody with extensive medical knowledge. In mid-February 1947, the LAPD served a warrant to the University of Southern California Medical School, which was located near the site of Short's body, requesting a complete list of program students. After receiving them, background checks would be conducted. However, they would yield no results, being yet another dead end. On October 28, 1949, Lieutenant Frank B. Jameson of the Bureau of Investigations officially detailed the description of the body in his report to H. L. Stanley, Chief of the Bureau of Investigations, which would be detailed as follows. The body had been cleanly severed at the midline. The lower half was laying about 1 foot south of the upper half. Both parts were laying absolutely flat. The protruding entrails of the lower one's half was lying under the buttocks. There was a marked post-mortem lividity on the top side of both parts, indicating that the victim had lain on her front side of her face for some period of time, immediately following her death. The body had been washed. There were bristles of a stiff brush adhering to the body. There were several lacerations on the forehead, which appeared to have been inflicted by a blunt instrument. Lacerated left breast and lacerated right breast, the top of which appeared to have been removed. The area covered by her pubic hair was slashed and cut off rather close to the skin. There was a tic-tac-toe slashing on the right hip. The mouth was badly slashed approximately 3 inches from the corners of the upper lips, deeply lacerated on the right side. There were possible strangulation marks and definite rope and tie marks on both lower arms and legs. From the lack of bloodstains under the body, it was a definite conclusion that she was killed elsewhere. Photographs were taken of the body and measurements, as well as photographs of the tire tracks on the curb at the point opposite of where the body was found. Upon removing all of the body by the coroner's deputies, it was found that the grass underneath the body was still wet with dew, indicating that the body had been placed there after the dew fell in the early morning hours, at approximately 2 a.m., January 15, 1947. Rigor mortis had not yet begun to set in, indicating that the murder would possibly have been committed after 1 a.m. on January 15, 1947. As the coroner believes, rigor mortis would set in within 10 hours of time. He stated that the cause of death was shock and loss of blood from hemorrhaging. He repeated that the ecchymosis appeared on the lacerations, on the head, face, and right breast, while slight ecchymosis appeared on the left breast, and on the right breast, and on the cut severing the midline of the body. There was no ecchymosis on all the other lacerations, indicating that they had been inflicted post-mortem. The fresh cut from her left thigh, weighing approximately a pound, was found in her vagina, and pubic hair was found in her rectum. There were no cigarette burns and no tattoo marks on her body. Mr. Ray Pinker of the crime laboratory was able to acquire a few drops of blood from the body. It was type AB. Unfortunately, an analysis to see if her body contained narcotics was not able to be done due to the vital organs having been lost or misplaced, and had likely been thrown out at the time they were clearing up the laboratory. This led to the decision of no further analysis being made. Now, by the spring of 1947, Elizabeth Short's murder had been classified as a cold case, due to there being few active leads. Sergeant Finis Brown was one of the lead detectives on the case. He blamed the press for compromising the investigation through reports and interpretations of details along with unverified reportings. The LAPD investigation into the murder of Elizabeth Short had begun after January 15, 1947, where detectives Harry Hansen and Phineas Brown had been assigned and remained as the primary investigators through the entire ordeal. It would be on September 1949 that a grand jury would be gathered in order to discuss the failings of the LAPD's Homicide Division. This was due to their failure to solve numerous murders, with the emphasis of those of children and women in the last few years, including the murder of Elizabeth Short. In the aftermath of the grand jury, a further investigation was done on Short's past, with detectives retracing her movements between Massachusetts, California, and Florida. However, these interviews yielded no useful information in the murder. It would be on January 10th of 1949 that Phineas Brown would first hear about a new suspect in the Black Dahlia murder case, when his partner, Harry Hansen, called him. Brown was working nights on special detail. Captain Kearney of Homicide directed the detectives to get to downtown as soon as possible. When asked, "What's up?" Kearney said, "Something pretty hot. How soon can you get down?" Dillon was booked as a suspect on January 10, 1949, at the Leimert Park station, north of downtown. Lead detectives Phineas Brown and Harry Hansen first questioned Dillon that evening. The night of January 11th, San Francisco police contacted the LAPD and informed them that they had located Jeff Connors. In April, Sergeant Brown and Officer Barnes of the Gangster Squad went to the Bay Area to interview witnesses for almost a week. They would go on to talk to Phil Caproni, Shirley Anderson, and Mr. and Mrs. Ross, Bill Dungams, McMurdo, Woody J. Wood, along with other suspects. However, Brown had made it clear that he had many reservations about the suspects and witnesses. He would go on to state, "For all the reports that I have read, other officers and my own reports would indicate that he was in San Francisco all during the time until the 22nd of January 1947. Then he went on to further say, "There was apparently nothing else we could expect as an alibi witness for Dillon if he would have been brought to trial." By the end of 1949, Phineas Brown no longer believed that Dillon was a viable suspect, but he said the investigation was not complete, including the verification of Dillon's work history and whereabouts at the time of the murder. Dillon did have an alibi supplied by witnesses, but not all of them were very convincing. After his release, Dillon sued the city of Los Angeles for $100,000. This incident led in part to the grand jury investigation noted previously. In the end, Jameson concluded, "It is the consensus of officers Ed Barrett, Jacques Semir, F.A. Brown, and the undersigned that there is insufficient evidence as of this date, October 28, 1949, upon which any suspect could be brought to the trial of murder of Elizabeth Short." On August 2, 1949, crime labs went to Alistair's Motel at 2901 South Flower Street and conducted chemical tests of all 10 cabins. Officers removed baseboards and thresholds from all the cabins in the search for blood residue. The tests were conducted by Chief Forensic Specialist Ray Pinker. No blood was found, with the exception of one room where the manager said a woman had menstruated on the sheets and a few drops of blood were found on the floor. By 1949, investigations into the murder of Elizabeth Short had turned to the possibility that she had been murdered in the Astor Motel. Both the Homicide and Gangster Squad would go on to work the case. Assistant Chief of Police Joe Reed was in charge. Lieutenant William Burns directed the Gangster Squad's own investigation, while Sergeant Phineas Brown ran the homicide investigation. Sergeant John Ashern, Sergeant Archie Case, and L.W. Wagner reported directly to Lieutenant Burns of the Gangster Squad. The homicide detectives reported directly to Sergeant Brown. It was recognized by all the officers that the case ultimately belonged to the Homicide Division. Some of the suspects in the investigation are as follows. Walter Bailey. Bailey was a Los Angeles surgeon who lived 1 block south of the vacant lot in which Short's body was found, until he left his wife in October 1946. His daughter was a friend of Short's sister Virginia, and had been the matron of honor at her wedding. When Bailey died in January 1948, his autopsy showed that he was suffering from a degenerative brain disease. After his death, his widow alleged that his mistress knew a terrible secret about Bailey and was made the main benefactor upon his death as a result. Bailey was never a suspect in the case proper. However, many medical doctors and others with medical training would be considered. In a secret testimony, Detective Harry Hansen, one of the original investigators, told the 1949 Los Angeles County Grand Jury that his opinion that the killer was a top medical man and a fine surgeon. Bailey was 76 years old at the time of the murder and had no known history of violence or criminal activity of any kind, and he was known to not have met Short, even though his daughter was a friend of Short's older sister. However, Bailey's neurodegenerative condition was known to produce violent behavior in otherwise passive individuals. His surgical specialization included mastectomies and hysterectomies, along with the surgical removal of fat. It must be noted that the site where the body was discovered was a stone's throw away from Bailey's former residence. Short would often falsely tell men that she had a son who had died tragically. Bailey did, in fact, have a son who was struck by a car and was killed at the age of 11. The deceased child's birthday was January 13th. Short's body was discovered on January 15th, leading to some to believe Short had been yet another mistress of Bailey's, and that she had been killed by him. Another individual of note was Jack Anderson Wilson, also known as Arnold Smith. Wilson was a lifelong petty criminal and an alcoholic, who was interviewed by author John Gilmore while Gilmore was researching for his book Severed. After Wilson's death, Gilmore named Wilson as a suspect owing to his alleged acquaintance of Short. Prior to Wilson's death, however, Gilmore had made an entirely different claim to the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner. In a story appearing on January 17, 1982, while Severed says that the homicide detective John St. John was about to close in on Wilson based on material Gilmore provided to St. John. St. John told the Herald-Examiner in the same article that he was busy with other killings and would review Gilmore's claims when he got the time. As a reliable source of information about the case, such as the FBI files and portions of the Los Angeles District Attorney's files, have become publicly available. Statements about Short's and the murders attributed to Wilson in Severed and supposedly tying him to the crime have not been found to be accurate. Severed also claims that Wilson was involved in the murder of Georgette Buford. Severed and many other sources based on Severed erroneously claimed that Short and Buford knew each other in Los Angeles, supposedly because they were both hostesses at the same nightclub. In reality, by the time that Short arrived in Los Angeles in 1946, Buford had been dead for 2 years, and the nightclub had been closed for about a year. Wilson was never suspected until Gilmore brought him up to the attention of authorities. Wilson features in Donald Wolfe's book, The Mob, The Mogul, and The Murder that transfixed Los Angeles. Wolfe hypothesized that Wilson was present at Short's murder and claims a connection between Wilson and the gangster Bugsy Siegel throughout some small-time gangsters Wilson supposedly associated with, and noted that he was also a member of the military, or a former member, dependent on the time of the interview. There were other suspects such as Patrick S. O'Reilly, Robert M. Red Manley, and George Hodel. However, it must be noted that even though the majority of the suspects in the case were male, the authorities would not rule out the possibility of the killer being a female. One theory held that Short had checked her baggage, including her clothing and cosmetics, a week before she died. She must have been staying with another woman, who had presumably lent her these essentials. During the interviewing time, another theory was put up that the assailant had bisected Short's body because he or she was not strong enough to move the body in one piece. There was a certain suspect who was simply referred to as Queer Woman Surgeon in the Los Angeles District Attorney's files. However, nothing seemed to come of it. Newspaper stories at the time implied that Short was either a lesbian or potentially a bisexual. However, the District Attorney files bluntly state Short had, no use for queers. The list of suspects ranged so broadly that even famed gangster Bugsy Siegel was considered a potential suspect. However, he was also ruled out. While there have been a handful of suspects in the case of the Black Dahlia, unfortunately, no one has yet to be even close to being considered as a potential suspect that could be convicted of the crime. As time has passed, the likelihood of any break in the case happening has only gone down. The killer of the Black Dahlia potentially had the chance to indulge in the sheer sensationalism of the case they caused. Over the years, many people have come forward claiming to have played a role in the death or have been the killer themselves. However, nothing has come of the investigation. If you have remained with me until the end, I thank you. And I do hope you stay tuned and subscribe for more content.